We're gonna appreciate the early attendees who are waiting in the room for us to get this started. So just give us a couple minutes. We're gonna let some other people trickle in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you waiting, if you'd like, for the question and answer portion of today's webinar, you'll be able to leave questions in the side chat on YouTube Live. You do need to log into your YouTube account, which is a pretty quick process there. So feel free while waiting here to go ahead and jump into the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself, tell us kind of what you came to learn about today, what company you're with, all that kind of good stuff. We'd love to see who's here. Give everybody one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started with intros and kick this thing off. Just as another reminder, we will be giving sending a recording of this webinar once it's completed. We do some little touch-ups here and there. We'll get it out to everybody who has signed up. So if you have to jump off for any reason, no worries. We will get you a copy of this once we are done. But it looks like we have a decent amount of people already in. So let's go ahead and kick this off. Welcome, everybody, to Pelion's webinar today. My name is Ryan Chacon with IoT for All, and I'll be your host. Today, our webinar is focused on teaching you everything you need to know about IoT security in 60 minutes. And yes, I know that sounds very ambitious, but I promise you that our experts today from Pelion are going to give you a great overview of what it takes and what goes into securing your IoT platform from end to end. So we really appreciate you being here today. And let's get into talking about those experts here. The first expert I'd like to introduce, Hagai Barel, the Senior Director of IoT Security. Welcome. Please feel free to give a quick introduction about yourself, and we'll keep going.
Yes, I'm Hagai Barel. It's going to be quick. I'm responsible for product security governance in Pelion. And that's it. For my background, Google my name.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And over to, let's bring in Neil Strachan, the Head of Product Strategy at Pelion. Welcome, Neil. Please feel free to give an introduction about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So I run product strategy. What that really means is it looks at our products, the mix of investment we put towards them, trying to position ourselves into the right places in the market in the next few years. My background is very much specifically on the IoT connectivity and then helping enterprises connect things to stuff, and more recently seeing security being in the forefront of all of their minds.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Just a few housekeeping items we have before we jump into this. The first one is, for those of you who did not hear my earlier message, the chat function in YouTube Live is available. So leave questions throughout the show as well. You do have to log into your YouTube account in order to leave questions. It's a pretty easy process, but feel free to do that. Also, introduce yourself. Tell us who's here. Name, title, company you work with, all that kind of good stuff, maybe what you're interested in learning about as well. And the second thing is we will be sending a recording of this to all of the signups or attendees today, as well as anybody who signed up, maybe not able to attend. So for some reason you have to jump off, don't worry, we will get you a copy of this once we are completed. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into it. I want to give you a quick high-level overview of the show today. So we for this webinar, we are going to be focusing on IoT security landscape. We're going to talk about the critical components of an IoT solution. We're also going to talk about how you can start securing your solution from the design phase, how to keep your things secure in operation, and then also how to integrate IoT security into your enterprise architecture. And then, of course, just like any good webinar, we are going to do some question and answer at the end. If any questions come in throughout the presentation that we feel are necessary to kind of interject, we'll go ahead and do that as well. But I don't want to waste any more of your time looking and listening to me. So let me get over to Neil, who's going to kind of take us through the presentation and enjoy, everyone.
Great, thank you for that. So just to set the scene, from Pelion, we are a connectivity and device management company that are focused very heavily on helping enterprises and OEMs build, manufacture, secure, deploy, connect all their devices. So We have a very long history being cultivated in ARM, and we've acquired many companies over the years. Very good market position, which means that we speak to lots of different verticals, different device manufacturers who all have many different needs. So we always have a very good position in the market for kind of understanding where we see customers' asks for today versus what their product lifecycle looks like and what they look to do in the future as well. So over the next 45 minutes to an hour, Hagai and I will hopefully be able to impress what we hear from the market, our customers, and what we try and also guide them towards, and how we can also help them be more secure and adopt a sort of security by design principle. So looking at the security, like we very much see like it's a puzzle. You know, there's many different things within an IoT deployment. You have suppliers, vendors, hardware, people, passwords, secure keys, all these different capabilities that all have to be pieced together to really sort of go towards a highly secure environment. And when you talk about the ecosystem, you know, you really see that it's very fragmented because of all those different players that we discussed. They all have their own approach, their own way of doing things, a lot of different techniques that can be used, you know, and a lot of different pieces of hardware, maybe with different capabilities that don't allow you to adopt a very high secure approach for securing the device itself. You know, technology is changing very, very fast, very rapidly. We've seen in the last 2 years many verticals really aggressively grow their, aggressively accelerate their product portfolio because, you know, with everyone working from home or supply chains being affected, we see a lot of verticals really accelerating the rate of technology change. So customers find that quite daunting. When they're looking at an IoT deployment, they think, I've got my requirements today, but what does that look like in 2 years' time or 5 years' time? And how do they keep being agile and adopt towards that? We also see there's a very complex perspective from a regulatory environment. We see different countries putting up different barriers of how data should be processed and how devices should be manufactured. In the United Kingdom, we have a secure by design framework being proposed that ensures that any consumer IoT device must conform to, you know, a checklist of things that they must achieve. That checklist may be very different to what comes in Germany or France or the US. So how do companies with global expansions or multi-region expansions address those security concerns? And then limited standardization. Nobody has come out and offered the real de facto standardization for IoT security from a device to cloud perspective. So it means you have a lot of vendors touting their own proprietary ways and techniques of doing things, which can be confusing for customers when they're just looking to say, I want my device and my deployment to be secure. So why is it difficult? You know, we have massive scale here. You know, we have a lot of devices that are going to be built, deployed, connected, managed. It means that there's a lot of attack vectors in that perspective. You know, many times are very, very small power devices with resources that are constrained on the device, and they don't very, you know, they're not interoperable. They don't work very well with legacy IT systems, or they can really create that problem to manage in the future. You know, with networks themselves, they also come with their own unique challenges where we see, you know, how much can you secure the actual physical device to securely connect to the network? How are the keys used to identify and connect to a network? And then securely routing data into applications. So very different complex structure. And then from a data, you know, you have to look at how you secure, encrypt, transmit data, where it's stored, how your users access it, and then also how your teams and people within your enterprise access and use that data as well. And then looking at the application stack, once you've actually looked at your end-to-end application, how do your customers interact with you as a secure vendor in terms of, you know, authentication to your platform, looking at how they actually, you know, request data from it and interact and use it. And when you start to say things like GDPR for that level of application data in Europe versus what happens in America, again, it becomes more complex, quite difficult. So the enterprise does have quite a complex landscape that as their ambitions grow, as they always do, into different regions, new products, new things, it becomes more difficult. And when we speak to our customers, that's a key area that we really try and help them with and understand, you know, where they're going today versus tomorrow. So when we moving forwards, the IoT it's a massive amount of different verticals. You can see very clearly that we have things from environmental monitoring, smart buildings, video, healthcare, smart manufacturing, and every one of those verticals will probably have different requirements on the physical hardware, the device itself. And how do you have principles that manage and can be spread across such a wide variety of gateways, hardware, sensors, and then you're looking at the connectivity side of it. How do you then connect those devices to the application? Does it use low power wide area? Is it wanting to use Wi-Fi? Is it wanting to use 5G in the future? And how do you then make sure that that's done as securely as possible in terms of actually encrypting the data when it's connecting over the air to something? And then in the cloud, look at the cloud vendor itself as a secure partner of the enterprise, but then also how they integrate and operate with the tool, with the data that these devices are generating and the value that can be created from them. So looking at how you bring that new modern IoT device into quite usually what can be quite a legacy IT system and enterprise environment. So what I'll do is I'll pass it over to Hagai, who will take through how he approaches security.
Sure, thank you. So there are a few things to keep in mind when we approach security for a new or an existing IoT project. They always say that addressing security has to be done from the start. This is trivial. I don't think this message even needs to be repeated. What we shall consider, however, is what does it mean to think of security? One of the key lessons that we learned is that thinking of security does not necessarily mean being entirely secure, and that's a mistake that is often made when IoT systems are deployed. Thinking of security from the start means having a methodology in place. It means being able to articulate the risk that the system has to cope with, and being able to properly prioritize the security posture elements. For example, it's obvious that the system has to be protected from script kiddies and automated attacks before it needs to be protected against more sophisticated attackers. So the critical part of establishing the security of a system is not just, it's first wisely prioritizing the elements of the security posture, but it's putting the framework in place to properly manage the risk across the entire life cycle. So it doesn't mean you need to be secure at first. You need to have a program that you can follow through and that improves security over time by a known set of priorities. Now, risk is all around us. The industry is quite tolerant towards risk, but not in any event, but just in the condition that the risk is properly articulated, that it's properly accounted for, and as long as there is a proper, visible risk reduction trajectory that the system goes through. So before you mitigate all attacks, you can contain them, you need to define them. An IoT system can live with a certain amount of residual risk as long as you can quantify it and as long as you can show a program by which it is gradually reduced. One other important notion is that IoT security is a combination of art and science, and in general, we recommend treating product security governance as science rather than as something more artistic or more fluid or subjective. One of the primary problems with security in general, not just IoT security, is that of coverage. When you look at plain engineering, then you know when you're done. The process is pretty linear. You start with some marketing requirements, you go towards defining system specification, HLDs, LLDs, then you write the code. You know when the system meets its objectives, you know when you're done. In security, there is one phase in the process which is not as linear. That's the phase in which the descriptive security objectives are turned into prescriptive instructions that can actually be engineered. When you look at security objectives are written in security language. They're not written in engineering language when you start. For example, if you look at security objectives, they usually refer to situations that shall not occur. This and that asset shall not be accessed by unauthorized people. That data shall not be altered by untrusted devices. This is not something engineers can work with. There is a stage in security engineering where the descriptive objectives are converted into prescriptive requirements, and this is where security is art as it is science. And it's important to recognize this phase when you look at the entire chain of security specification. And this is true for security at large, but in IoT security, it's even more critical because the systems are so inherently more complex and contains so many independent components where it's hard to properly understand your full security postures. Those gaps, this stage in which you have to articulate security objectives that are high level in language that can actually be adhered to by the engineering teams, makes security not just more difficult to implement properly, and you leave holes behind. It also makes it harder to sell. It's harder to convince the users or the customers of the system that the system is of an adequate security posture. If you cannot show that you are done, if you cannot show that the system is secure because of that wide challenge of coverage, it's hard for you to prove its robustness. That's why we usually say that when you define the security features of a system, when you define its security properties, its security controls, you need to be creative. You need to be able to show creativity. However, the product security governance itself should be a scientific process. I mean, you need to put a process in place that can demonstrate how each and every of the security objectives of the system is met, is accomplished by a set of engineering controls. Only when you have this process, and this process is algorithmically sound, can you actually attest for the security of your system.
There you go. I was on mute for 2 seconds. Yeah. So when we look at the foundations that and the processes that the guy talks about, it also very much talks about what's the life cycle of this. So the foundations of securing an IoT product, putting that into the enterprise, and going through your engineering teams, and also then the secure framework that you build onto is one part of it. The entire life cycle of the organization needs to look at security full forwards as well. So, Hagai, back to you.
So, moving forward, we can what we brought up is a few tips that we found to be the most valuable or the most critical. First and foremost, and that connects to things that I said earlier, you need to work in an organized fashion. It's very tempting when you work on security. It's very tempting to adopt a bottoms-up approach. For example, let's do a security assessment. Let's do a pen test and start from there. It's tempting because it's easy to start. Running a pen test, I mean, you can do it for a very low cost now, either in-house or externally. But that's not a good indication of how secure the system is. It's only a good indication of how secure the system is against an opponent that invested the same time, energy, and cost into testing or exploiting your system. So an organized fashion from our perspective is a top-down fashion. It's the process in which you start with defining your assets. Some people call it threat modeling, and it has other names in the security industry. Starting from the top, from your assets, which are usually not related to IoT. They more relate to the business that you're in, and going forward and deriving objectives and sub-objectives, eventually crossing the chasm, that nonlinear stage that I mentioned earlier, and defining security requirements or security controls. So one thing is go top down. Don't just pick up whatever you see and try to address it. Don't go by looking at, say, OWASP top 10 or any other list of vulnerabilities and address those. Be methodological about it. Start with a good methodology that follows the typical way that engineers usually do things, just tailor it towards security governance. Second is accept that the system will never be entirely secure. So if your security process is such that requires the system to be completely secure when you launch it, then your system will just never be launched, period. And I can tell that from experience. The security process shall assume that there is a level of residual risk in the system at any given time. And as I said earlier, the industry is tolerant towards systems that have residual risks. You just need to know what the risk is. You need to quantify it. You need to be able to point to the implication of that risk, and you need to be able to show a trajectory in which the risk is reduced over time. As long as you know what the risk is, it's okay to have some of it, as long as it's something that's accounted for and you can compensate with additional controls. Finally, you have to be prepared in your security process to have security be an ongoing part of your engineering system. You need to be, by design, properly imperfect. And that should not deteriorate from your confidence in running the system. You need confidence in the security posture of the system. You do not necessarily need to be 100% secure at any given moment. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, that's for you, I guess.
Yeah. So, a lot of customers come to us, and there's a question from Nadia, which I'll kind of start with, actually, saying, how do you convince your organization that IoT is worth the risk, and how do you get buy-in from stakeholders who are concerned? Now, kind of before I move on to the zero trust slide we talk about here, IoT is one of those foundational technologies that underpins business transformation. You have companies who will look to utilize IoT for their own use case. So, a company that owns a water infrastructure, they'll look at having sensors to understand the quality of the water, the ability to change the flows and the pressures in piping. They'll utilize those sensors to improve their understanding of their infrastructure. And coming back to that use case is actually saying, well, what are the benefits of being able to understand that? Is it a reduction in cost for the operational perspective? Is it an ability to predict a failure that's going to happen ahead of time because of being able to look at trends in the usage of the device? And 9 times out of 10 companies who are looking at IoT to use it for themselves are very much already looking for savings and the way to utilize technology to be more efficient. So always coming back to the efficiency from that helps get that buy-in internally. I've worked with a lot of public sector companies over the years who've always battled that. And public sector can always be really come down with budget savings usually, and being able to come back to efficiencies, budget savings, making it more operationally efficient helps that use case. If someone's looking to build a new product and they're looking to utilize IoT to really build an IoT product, they're looking at a consumer product as a service model where we have something that was maybe traditionally a one-off cost, one-off sale. It was fairly dumb. It wasn't connected to the internet. How do they move up and differentiate and maybe offer new business models, whether it's a recurring business model, be able to have a revenue basis every month renting the service, or is it something that's outcome based, where it could be a piece of hardware that will only be charged when it generates the event, it has detected something. So this isn't how it works, but with the Nest cameras, where they actually have the ability to sense people and see what's happening, one business model that you could change that market is saying, actually, you'll only be charged when the IoT camera has done something, viewed somebody, and given you the alert that there's somebody that you do not know at the door. So very outcome based. And when you actually start to come back into that mode, you look at the differentiation in the market against competitors in your vertical, and actually saying, look at where the business can take you. Sometimes it can cost a lot to get up and running, and if you want to fully build everything in-house, build your own hardware, source everything independently, hire teams to do so. But there's also a lot of off-the-shelf hardware, a lot of off-the-shelf capabilities and software and tools to do this, to really test the idea, work with it, and actually going with customers once you've tested the idea and saying, hey, this looks like it's something for my industry or my market. That proof point allows you to really drive it home internally as well. So when we talk about back to security, looking at zero trust, this is a technique that is popular over the last many years, but within IoT, it kind of is it's been talked about a lot more, because what we see is that enterprises who use maybe a zero trust mechanism to secure all of their infrastructure, all of their laptops, their phones, everything is out there. They're looking to adopt IoT devices into the same matrix, sorry. And this is quite difficult, because it all of a sudden expands the infrastructure and the web of managed things essentially beyond the office. As we went to COVID, work from home, that was like another step. Everyone was now on devices in their home, a different security concern to think about. But if you expand that even further and say now you want to manage IoT devices, cameras, smart meters, temperature sensors that are far away from human touch, you really have to really think about how do you manage them as almost as users on your network and your infrastructure within that capability. And the four sort of key factors here to think about is it's an approach that it's a framework to think. It's not, you don't go and buy zero trust. You have to adopt it and work on it. You look at the uniqueness of the devices that are out there, very much change how it can be attacked. A smart meter is a very low power, very small amounts of capabilities on it, in comparison to something that might be like an edge gateway for building management. This does access control. So those two devices have two different security profiles and concerns and what you would want to look at. You have to look at saying, how do you identify devices that are at risk? And what that means is, if you have 100, 200, 300,000 devices that are out there, it's quite difficult to manage. You're not logging into a system and selecting one by one which one looks okay. You're very much wanting to see what are the percentage of devices that are performing abnormally. And to do that, you have to have an understanding of what is normal for those devices and create a model that allows you to identify devices behaving abnormally, and that could be at risk. And then again, understanding the network behavior is very key. This allows you to really understand that what devices are attaching to this to your IoT solution, connecting to it. Look at the identity of the devices, how often they're sending data, where are they sending data to, what protocols are they using, and this is very much builds up a good picture of a well-behaving device that is in theory secure versus a device that is abnormally infected or compromised in some way. And when you build up those models and understand it, always learning to segregate the devices that are at risk or not performing correctly is key. So taking action very quickly. So we have a customer that was many years ago had a device that was infected somehow and was behaving abnormally, sending data to the wrong place, looking very strange in all of their monitoring tools. And they worked out what that was, and that it was a specific firmware version that they'd rolled out. They're able to segregate the devices on those firmware and then roll it, update it, change the security profile remotely over the air before the other few hundred of devices had been behaving in that same way. So always learning, taking action continually is key. As you say, it's a life cycle. It's not, you don't start off secure and then you're secure forever. You have to consistently learn going through that. So as we look at security as part of the enterprise, like we see enterprises really aspire to be secure first. Like they wanted to build their devices and say they are secure. part of this is that, as we say, integrating IoT with the legacy infrastructure does create that interesting dynamic. How do you manage all of these devices in the same way? How do you have your network center, your security center, your IT support teams understanding what IoT devices are doing, what they're behaving? We look at saying things like the security can sometimes focus on the device itself, but maybe the integration of the entire security into the operational components is key for customers. Like the security element is as a stack, as you say, from objectives to controls and the implementation, and then really sort of how do you unify the top of the stack? Recently, we did a survey with the GSMA, and we surveyed about 85. We surveyed like thousands of enterprises in Europe, North America on their deployments. It really came up that 85% of them have changed their overall security practices as of adopting IoT. They've 60% very much going secure first, and then looking at saying actually 72% are very much focused on device to cloud, an end-to-end security profile for their IoT deployment, how they integrate that, and then looking at saying security helps them reset and meet their regulatory needs. So guys, is there anything you want to add on to this slide?
All in all, I think that when we integrate IoT into the enterprise, we need to realize that at the end of the day, I mean, IoT is a technology. It's a class of technological capabilities and technical components. And security is eventually a stack where you start by defining assets and then you go on and protect them. And when you work methodologically, you notice that the part at which IoT introduces its own particularities is rather low in that security implementation stack. So the way we see it, I mean, we do not address IoT security as a separate paradigm of security. We see it as part of engineering, where the top-level assets are usually those that belong to the organization, and the IoT just introduces additional challenges in an existing framework.
So there is another question from Norman. Haggai, what are the potential implications for businesses if a breach occurs?
Okay, so that's a rather wide question. I mean, it's almost as asking what is the length of a rope, but of course it depends. But we normally classify impacts of breaches or security issues into different criteria of potential damage. One is technical, that is data that is lost in terms of confidentiality, data that is altered integrity-wise, all denial of service, for example, availability of the system. Those are all technical aspects. In addition to those, we see perception and PR implications. Then there are also legal implications against customers and otherwise, and of course compliance, either compliance with the standards that we comply with, or compliance with a local regulation. So whenever we classify potential breaches and we do use that to prioritize our security investment, we look at those different categories to see what the implication of a breach is. All in all, I mean, other than the technical part, the impact of the breach depends on the circumstances of its exploitation. For example, if we have a certain type of data that's stolen or that gets compromised, I rather have it done by some APT coup or using a sophisticated zero-day attack rather than by a script kiddie running Metasploit. So when we assess the impact of a breach in terms of PR and in terms of our legal liabilities, it's not just what has been affected, but also the circumstances, such as what is the type of fault that was exploited to cause that.
I wanted to I want to jump in real quick and just ask kind of follow up to that. Do you guys see a correlation between the likelihood of a breach occurring through in an IoT solution based on the amount of time, effort, money, when in the process somebody so they really start to take security seriously? Do you kind of see a correlation with any of those elements or variables?
Yeah, absolutely. Like what we've seen is within IoT, I've seen customers come with their fingers burned, essentially saying, "Hey, my deployment previously didn't go so well, got hacked, things happened. What do I do now moving forwards?" And what we see them invest when they've had that fingers burned approach, they invest heavier into security to avoid happening again. And 99% of the time, they actually do. Nothing bad happens for them moving forwards because they've adopted stuff. But when we've seen, this comes very much from IoT changing from an architect or a group of engineers or somebody with an idea, building a solution, and then coming towards a product. Essentially, over the last 5-7 years, we've seen like the rise of the product manager essentially into IoT, which is coming representing the business's needs as well as the product's needs into what they're creating. And because of that, we're seeing that security first principle come through, because they take security as a key foundation as what they're building from an early stage. I wouldn't say it's much more about the more they invest, the more secure they are, but it's more aware they are, and the smarter they are at the beginning allows them to be more flexible and aware throughout the life cycle of their deployment. You look at the most secure thing has to be completely disconnected from anything inside a bunch of cement, because nothing can get to it. So you're always going to be compromised, the ability to be compromised in some way, and it's the understanding to how to react to that.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, great.
So the one other sort of point I was going to say around the implication of our business for breach occurs is brand as well. If it becomes that severe, the impact on the brand and the products can be quite damaging as well, to the extent of you may lose your market position, you may lose other customers, and the competition may start to focus more heavily on security as their messaging, because it's clear that you may not be if it's out there in the public. So moving forwards, the top takeaways that we try to talk about. Hagai, I'll let you kind of talk about the design, and I'll talk about operation.
Yeah, I think that most of it was discussed already in terms of product security governance. I mean, obviously, we preach towards an algorithmic approach to be able to numerically assess the risk and the risk reduction trajectory by means that do not require hand waving. This is important, not just so the system is more secure and that you don't leave holes behind, which is the biggest problem in security all in all. It's also important because it allows you to demonstrate your security posture both to auditors and to customers. I can tell you that our ability to sell, in air quotes, Pelion security to our customers was dramatically improved once we became able to articulate the residual risks in the system in a way that is algorithmic. Every statement that we make about the security posture is something we can prove or demonstrate and prove in a way that we can stand behind, and which is entirely objective. And there are no subjective statements in our security posture, and that's a very useful position to be in when you design systems that handle critical assets. As also mentioned earlier, the security governance process has to cope well with imperfection of the security posture. The system is so complex and there are so many risks there that you are never going to be done. And not just that you're not going to be done, you keep introducing additional entry into this ever-living system. So your security program has to be such that copes with imperfection. And coping with imperfection means accepting risk and being able to measure it, articulate it, and hence compensate for it by other auxiliary methods. such as insurance or
Mhm.
properly segregating your network, or there are all sorts of other technical ways to cope with residual risk that you want to avoid. Last but not least, we believe that IoT security has to be treated as another discipline of engineering, not necessarily of security. There is no such thing as IoT security. There is security, which is the methodology and methods and approaches and systems to protect assets against potential compromises by attackers. The fact that this is IoT means that assets might be IoT specific at the lower level, or that attacks are attacks from the IoT space, such as an opponent having physical possession of a field device. Yeah, that's IoT dependent, but this is not separate security. That's the same security manifesting itself in the IoT space. And if you end up focusing too much on IoT as a security discipline, you might miss the bigger picture, and that's the overall background for this recommendation.
Yeah, I think looking at as I said earlier, from an operational standpoint, security does not stop from an adoption standpoint. You always have to learn, consistently evolve, look at the techniques that are used to maintain your security, and that's key within large enterprises that you see have been very successful in the cloud space or SaaS space, who focus very much on the security first design as well. That again should revolve back to your IoT devices and what you utilize for them. Hagai said there's no such thing as IoT security. So the second point I will reword to saying integrating the security of your IoT device is key, rather than saying IoT security. That point is that you need to treat security as one throughout your organization, and that goes from the same process as access control into the office, as it goes to the access of deployment of an IoT device and who's the engineer visiting it, maybe actually deploying it, what capabilities revolves around that. So it has to be interwoven through all of the foundational areas of your business. And then I think that point is like security. You have that feeling that when you buy a new laptop, it's not secure until you install an antivirus system or something, and that gives you peace of mind when you think, okay, my laptop is protected. Or if it's your parents' laptop, you think, okay, they're not going to phone me saying they've put their credit card details into something instead, because it gives you a peace of mind from a product perspective. In an IoT perspective, that peace of mind comes from a regulatory compliance perspective and understanding that you are more protected for the devices that are put into the field. And what I always say to our customers is that it actually really gives a competitive advantage in the market. So many verticals at the moment are looking at how they reinvent themselves, and they utilize IoT to really build something new into their market. And because of that, they really want to focus on differentiation. And if it's a smaller player trying to bite at the heels of the big incumbents in their vertical, security is a key part to make sure that they're at least on parity with the big players, but more niche, more capability around what they're doing, so that they're able to really focus and win business and innovate. So Matthew asked a question if there's industries or use cases that are at greater risk. Absolutely. You look at the healthcare, you look at banking, financial, or even anything to do with consumer products and their data. They're always going to be more at risk than something like smart metering or very, 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 very low power, sensors like car park spaces being green, red, or amber. And when you look at those different spaces, the investment has to be a lot higher into security. But typically, it becomes because those are large industries with the money to invest into how they build a more secure product. Healthcare finance is one example. They cannot it cannot fail if it involves people's livelihoods, people's health data, and if it's financial transactions, the amount of money that can be lost if something goes wrong. So they'll focus very heavily, but they'll come at it 9 times out of 10 with a very traditional understanding of security. How do they map that onto IoT devices? Sometimes it's just simply not possible. Sometimes the hardware is too constrained to do it. Sometimes they have to make allowances and make decisions they didn't want to be able to utilize IoT to get the benefits of it. But because they're doing that, they have to really understand what they've agreed to, what they've made the compromise on, and how to react if something happens in the future. So from that perspective, I hope everyone has had a good amount of information from Hagai and I. We'll open it up for questions and answers, and Ryan can come in and or moderate. We'll go through that. But from a Pelion perspective, look, I think I hope you understand that we do help enterprises every day connect, manage, deploy, and secure their devices. And if you're in that phase at the moment, and you feel you would like more help, please feel free to reach out myself, Hagai, directly, or just go to our website, get in touch. It will all be part of the message going out.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. I've been watching the whole time in the green room while you all have been presenting, and it's been great. So I hope our audience is finding a lot of value in it. We'll make sure that all the contact information, all the necessary ways people can follow up after the fact will be included in all the things that we send out, all the promotion we do for it afterwards as well. But yeah, let's get into these questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So Tony starts off, says this has been a great presentation on his end. What do you think the next big IoT security threat is, and how do you see the threat landscape potentially changing?
Yeah, sure. Well, that has multiple answers, but one thing we do notice, and one major threat in security in general and also in IoT, stems from the business model or business models that emerge around exploitation of security flaws. The emergence of business models around exploitation cause creation of ecosystems, and this gets more and more motivated players into the security exploitation game. And I think we see it now happening in full speed in the area of ransomware, which is not entirely IoT, but is related in terms of what exploitation consists of and how it can be monetized. So today I can launch a ransomware attack without knowing much technology at all and without getting up from my chair at all. I mean, there are already underground players that are good with building ransomware toolkits. There are others that specialize in extracting the money. There are others specialized in laundering the money, and so forth. This ecosystem causes many additional players to enrich our landscape of enemies that hasn't been very, very small in the first place. So once we see more ecosystems around exploitation feeding more mouths in a way that is scalable, then that's when we'll see more IoT systems getting exploited. That's at least one trend that I see, and that causes me to lose some sleep.
Yeah, I'll give you, to be honest, when I haven't had too much exposure to ransomware just personally, but when the pipelines here were attacked a number of months back, I mean, personally in my family, everyone we felt that with, gas shortages, gas prices going crazy, that kind of thing. So it is a kind of a scary situation, but something that you did mention is it's getting easier for that to happen, but that's why security is so important.
It's easier and there's more money. There is money involved in the system.
100%.
So far, so if you look at an IoT system several years ago, who would attack it? It was either for very narrow financial motivation, just for bragging, or for national security reasons, which is very significant, but not very common. On the other hand, now, when you can so easily monetize exploitation of a security breach, then that's going to be way more common that we used to see. What you see in ransomware and the IT and the enterprise space now is what's going to happen in IoT in 5 years or less. And you saw that with Colonial Pipelines already, and unfortunately, I don't think it's the last case.
No, unfortunately, I agree with you. So let's get to the next question here. Jesse has a question. What security concerns are top of your customer's agenda at the moment?
Well, I think at the moment it's very much the ecosystem and the supply chain of creating something. There's so many different partners, so many different players, from the the silicon player to the hardware provider to the OEM, maybe the consultants they're using, all the different players that can be used in creating a project. It's how they actually try and maintain a consistent security profile across everyone. And that something that customers consistently ask us, even of our vendors. We are a connectivity supplier that we have many partners all the way through the value chain. And we're SOC 2 compliant, we're ISO 27002 from a security perspective. So we also have to be rigorous on our vendors and our suppliers to maintain a certain security profile back. So very much trust of their partners and is always comes very key to mind. But when the other perspective is always about data and Lucy has another question about changing regulatory environment. That's also completely the forefront of it. Like everyone's putting up barriers and around their country about what they do with their data that is generated there. If it's to do with consumers, it should be treated differently to machines sometimes. How a machine might be identified as a person and the tracking it. So there's loads of different concerns around security and the data that they generate. What we recommend generally is do your diligence on the countries that you're deploying into for your own product. We can advise you about what we know from that market and say here's where we are, but being able to understand what is the regulatory environment today. Is there any big movements or frameworks being talked about moving forwards? But to stay ahead of that technically, we always advise customers to deploy with like the most flexible products and solutions. From a connectivity standpoint, you look at EUICC and eSIM being quite a foundational component that allows customers to change the connectivity profile and localize into a country rather than using roaming or a more legacy option. That allows customers to know that, okay, if something happens, like if Germany decide that no devices are allowed to roam in the country and that all data must be stayed locally and the keys to access networks must be local to their country, knowing that you've deployed using something like EUICC allows them to localize and make that act in the future. Very similarly, from a device management perspective, the ability to segment, change, and update the firmware and the security credentials of the device remotely, very key. So flexible products, flexible vendors that care about security.
So let me ask you guys a question. So I've had this debate on our podcast before about where the responsibility lies with security for an IoT solution. And the reason that we talk about it so much is there's so many different pieces to a solution, right? You have the hardware, you have the manufacturer, everyone involved in that process. Then you have the connectivity, you have everything going to the cloud, then the user interface. I mean, potentially the edge is involved. And then obviously the decision maker at the end of the day is oftentimes the end user, the customer, but they're leaning on a systems integrator or a security company or one of the potential vendors in the process to help guide them in the right decision. So how do you kind of view the responsibility for security? Is it everyone's job along the entire way, or do you kind of see it split kind of in a different idea?
Guy, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's substantially different. I mean, well, it's easy to see security as something that is inherently special, particularly for me, because that's what I do for a living. But all in all, that's not necessarily much different than the situation of quality or availability. You can see security as part of quality in a sense. So we believe that here there's a shared responsibility model. Which splits the responsibility and as it does the liability between the various stakeholders, just like with any other complex system out there. So every part of the system has its written, more or less official assumptions of the systems that it or the parts that it interacts with, and every provider is responsible for its own system. Usually in, say, 90% of the cases, not that I can substantiate this number, but let's say more or less 90% of the cases, it's pretty obvious who's responsible for a particular breach. Like when you look at security breaches that happened in the past, it was rather obvious, for example, in Heartbleed or any other security exploits in code, it's very obvious where the issue is. Same in IoT, we experienced some problems with some security issues, one of the clients that were clients as in device client, not client as in customer. It is rather obvious what part of the system violated its assumption, its contract against the other parts with which it interacts. And there are always the 10% where it's not entirely clear. Sometimes exploitation requires flaws that are exhibited in two related components. That is, both components are broken, but it needed both of them together for the attack to be feasible. So then it's a more complex question. But all in all, I think that the same shared responsibility models that we already know and use in distributed systems apply here as well.
I think to add on to that, there's, as well as shared responsibility, there is an expectation from the end user or the enterprise that who they buy from should own the security. They should own the end security overall of their end-to-end product. And that has changed some of the buying behaviors we've seen over the last few years. So, a lot of our customers now are saying they will go to their cloud provider that they built on top of and ask them, who is their integrated partner for this product, for this capability that I need? Because they're expecting the big guys, AWS, Google, Microsoft, to have vetted that partner, brought them into the ecosystem, fully understood, fully secure in the same way that they operate, because they're looking at Azure and these guys as the big players in trust. And that's something that us as is that middleman between the device and the cloud itself. We don't provide the hardware, we don't provide the cloud, we help everything in the middle. We've seen that disruption in the market where the people are going to cloud, we're integrating and we're working with our cloud partners and helping their customers on a similar point. But when Microsoft brings someone to us or Amazon do that, they ask us about our security principles to match up against theirs as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's just such an interesting conversation. And then people, in these business environments bring consumer products into and onto the network and things like that. So it's just, I can imagine it's a very tricky web to weave, tricky process to kind of evaluate and work with customers on from day to day.
Yep, exactly.
Before we wrap up,
supply chain security is one of the bigger challenges now. That's the challenge of the century. Supply chain security, and that's part of the reason.
It's been a very hot topic, just supply chain in general in our world right now. It seems like everything is going through a kind of an overhaul and a process, and security is a huge part of that. So absolutely agree. I know we have a couple minutes left to wrap up, but I did have one question I was thinking about earlier on when you were all talking about business models, which I think is something very interesting to kind of expand on. When you all work with companies, is there a particular ROI that they are all focused on, and we've talked about matching that up with business models like consumption-based business models or outcome-based business models? How do you all determine the right business model for a customer of yours, and what is oftentimes the ROI that they're coming to you to look for to kind of get out of the solution that they're building?
Yeah, I think like the business models that we see is most people looking to move into a subscription model or a predictive business model where they can sell based on the outcomes. That's what most people are looking for today. From a security context, people are not willing to come along and then pay extra for the secure version. They expect it to be completely secure from it. So we don't see security coming too much into the business model. It comes into the costs of obviously running Pelion in the business and what we build into it. However, it doesn't get added onto the security business model. From an ROI perspective, every cent, every penny counts in IoT. Everyone is pushing to squeeze to get the devices to the lowest possible cost so that they can deploy more. And that has its own problems. How do you actually manage a business if you're trying to run at low margins from it? And then also, that ROI is always as much as they can get, right?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. It's been something that I think a lot of companies have questions about. So I think what you all are doing is fantastic. But yeah, it looks like we got to wrap up here. We're kind of coming up on our hour. The conversation today has been fantastic. Really appreciate kind of all the insights. I'm sure our audience is going to find a ton of value out of listening to both of you. So if any of you out there want to follow up, you can follow Pelion IoT on Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, doing a lot of great stuff on the social channels. The company itself, they have a lot of great things going on. We'll make sure we include all of that information, all the emails, all the information to follow up after the fact in our descriptions and all the material we put out there as well. So feel free to check them out, touch base, and have a conversation. So thank you guys again.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.